Let's be honest, just hearing the word cannibalism makes most of us, well, kind of recoil, right? It's pretty much humanity's biggest taboo. But what if we could just push past that initial horror for a second? What if we looked at it less like a monster story and more like a really complex psychological puzzle? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today.
So let's just dive right into the deep end with the biggest, most obvious question. Why? I mean, really, what could possibly drive a human being to eat another human? And you're going to see that the answer, well, it's not simple. It's not one thing at all. It's a whole spectrum of reasons, and some of them might surprise you.
And you see, that's at the key shift in perspective we need to make right now. We're not here for the cheap thrills or the horror movie stuff. We're here to ask why. For psychology, the goal isn't to get a shock reaction. It's to actually understand the gears turning in the mind when it's pushed to its absolute most extreme limits.
Okay, so let's get a little formal for just a second and put a real definition on this. Cannibal psychology. It's the study of all of it. The mental, the emotional, the social, even the biological factors. The big takeaway here is that it's never, ever just one thing. It's more like untangling this super complex web of different forces all pushing in the same direction.
All right, first up, let's tackle the category that, is maybe the easiest for our brains to wrap around, even though it's still absolutely horrifying. We're talking about survival. This is what happens when there is simply no other choice, when the will to live smashes head-on into an impossible situation. And the situation is just brutally simple. This is the absolute last resort. You have to understand, the choice isn't should we or shouldn't we. The choice is between this and certain death. For everyone. Can you imagine the kind of calculation the mind has to make in that moment?
So think of your brain like it has two different operating systems. Normally, our moral reasoning is running the show, guiding our social behavior. But in a life-or-death situation like this, a switch gets flipped. A much older, more primitive system takes over. That survival instinct becomes this biological override that just shuts everything else down. All that matters is one single primal question. How do I stay alive?
And look, this isn't some abstract thought experiment. This has happened. We have these gut-wrenching, real-world examples. You've probably heard about the Andes plane crash survivors, right? Or stories of sailors shipwrecked for months, or the absolute desperation in times of war and famine. The key thing to remember is these weren't monsters. They were just regular people, like you and me, pushed way beyond what any human should have to endure. So, here's the bottom line for this section, and it's super important. From a purely psychological standpoint, this isn't insanity. It's not a mental illness. It's a tragic, horrifying, but ultimately adaptive survival behavior. Faced with an absolute catastrophe, the mind is literally just doing the one job it was designed for, to survive at all costs.
Okay, let's pivot. We've talked about the biological drive to survive. But what happens when we move into the social realm? What if this thing we consider the ultimate taboo just isn't a taboo at all? What if it's actually part of a society's tradition? This is where we really have to try and take off our modern Western glasses for a minute. For some societies, this act wasn't about violence or hunger. It was a complex ritual, absolutely packed with meaning. Maybe it was a way to honor a loved one who passed, or to take on the strength of a defeated enemy. It could even be seen as a sacred duty.
So you might be asking, how on earth does that become normal? Well, it's a process, right? It all starts with social learning. Kids see it, they're taught about it, and after a while, that leads to cultural normalization. It just becomes the way things are done here. And then comes the final crucial step. The culture gives the act a powerful spiritual or social meaning. It's not just an action anymore, it's a symbol.
And this just goes to show you the incredible, almost unbelievable power of culture on our minds. I mean, we are fundamentally wired to fit in with our tribe, with our social group. And if that group, that culture, tells you that something is not just normal but sacred, your brain is very, very likely to just adopt that belief system, completely overriding what the rest of us might think is a universal taboo.
Okay, now we head into darker territory. We've covered survival, and we've covered culture. Now we get to the third category, the one that, let's be honest, is the source of all the horror movies and nightmares. This is where we talk about the pathological mind. Right off the bat, we need to be crystal clear about something. These cases are extremely rare, like true statistical anomalies. But because they are so unbelievably shocking, they're what everyone thinks of when they hear the word.
What we're really looking at here is a complete and catastrophic breakdown of a person's mind.
So when forensic psychologists dig into these cases, they almost always find a whole cocktail of severe mental health conditions. You've got things like psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, which basically means a total inability to feel empathy for another person. Or you might see severe schizophrenia, where someone is driven by powerful delusions. And then there are paraphilic disorders, where the act itself gets tangled up with violent fantasies.
And those conditions, they create a really terrifying internal landscape. We're talking about a complete lack of empathy, zero guilt or remorse, an obsessive need for control and dominance, and often a total disconnect from reality. That's the toxic mix, the psychological cocktail that can bubble up into these kinds of horrific actions.
But the story rarely starts there. If you look back into the lives of these individuals, what you almost always find is a heartbreaking backstory of severe trauma. We're talking horrific childhood abuse, deep neglect, being completely isolated from society. Now, to be clear, this is absolutely not an excuse for their actions, but for psychology, it's a crucial part of the puzzle that helps explain how a mind could become so broken.
And sometimes the problem isn't just psychological, it's literally physical. It's in the brain itself. A lot of research points to problems with the frontal lobe. You can kind of think of the frontal lobe as the CEO of your brain. It's in charge of morality, decision-making, self-control, the whole shebang. So what happens if the CEO isn't just having a bad day, but is completely offline? Well, that's when the most extreme, dangerous impulses can run wild with nothing to stop them.
Okay, so after all that, survival, culture, pathology, it brings us to a really important clarifying question. Can we just make a blanket statement and say that cannibalism is always a sign of mental illness?
And the answer is a huge, flashing, definitive no. And this is probably the single most important takeaway. Psychology draws very clear lines in the sand here. Survival cannibalism, that's an adaptive response to a disaster. Cultural cannibalism, that's a socially learned behavior. It's only the criminal, pathological type that's typically tied to severe mental illness. Mixing up these three different categories is, without a doubt, the biggest mistake people make when thinking about this.
So we've spent all this time exploring the why behind the act itself. But let's turn the lens around for a second. Let's talk about us, about you. Why are we so fascinated by this? Why can't we look away?
Well, there's a psychology to our curiosity, too. Think about it. Taboos are like magnets for our brains. We're just wired to be curious about the forbidden. We want to know what the absolute limits of human behavior are. It's kind of like getting to peek over the edge of a cliff. You get the thrill of looking into the abyss, but from a totally safe distance. And let's be real, the media knows we're fascinated, and they definitely lean into it.
So at the end of the day, if we just write this whole thing off as a simple monster story, we're missing the entire point. It's so easy to just slap a label like evil on it and then turn away. But the real understanding, that's buried much, much deeper.
Because ultimately, this extreme taboo behavior, it's like a strange kind of mirror. It reflects the most powerful parts of the human condition back at us. It shows us the raw, undeniable power of our survival instinct. It shows us how deeply culture can shape our reality. And it shows us the tragic consequences of a mind that's completely broken. It reveals the absolute outer edges of what the human mind can do. And that's something that's worth trying to understand.